Human beings are not born into identities, they are conditioned into them. Identity becomes a kind of echo chamber, a repeating pattern of cues, reinforcements, and punishments that teach individuals how to locate themselves within a social design. Whiteness emerged within that framework not as a cultural root, but as a classification mechanism, a sorting system that assigned value. It created a hierarchy where complexion, origin, and proximity to perceived purity became passports to privilege, even as those passports were quietly policed by systems above them. From another perspective, the white identity, therefore, was never a self-originating truth. It was a contract. As shared in the previous narratives, those inducted into it accepted not just belonging and protection, but also obligation, an unspoken agreement to participate in maintaining the very hierarchy that conferred their relative advantage. In that sense, whiteness was less an inheritance and more a performance, a role rewarded when well played and punished when breached. Pause. This is what makes whiteness not an identity, but a mechanism. It operates as an infrastructure of control, a psychological algorithm built into social institutions and cross-generational memory, ensuring that participants unconsciously replicate the system's boundaries even when consciously rejecting its ideology. One of the most enduring illusions in human history is not political, nor is it economic or technological. It is psychological. Part of this psychology is the illusion of identity, the belief that whiteness is a natural, self-evident category of human being. If racism is a product, then whiteness is not an identity. It has been marketed as one, felt as one, defended as one, but upon closer examination, it dissolves. What remains is not an identity at all, but a system working in lockstep with racism. A social psychological grid designed to regulate perception, resource flow, and belonging. This grid is not maintained by free thought or shared humanity. It is sustained through emotional manipulations, identity conditioning, and carefully structured reward systems. It promises safety, stability, and superiority, but delivers compliance, division, and dependency. Whiteness has never been stable. Its boundaries have shifted continuously based on structural needs rather than moral reasoning or cultural coherence. At different points in history, entire groups now labeled white existed outside its protective shell. For example, Eastern Europeans, Irish immigrants, Southern Italians, many were initially excluded from the privileges whiteness provided. They were labor sources, not identity participants. Their inclusion came not through recognition, but through utility. Whenever hierarchy required reinforcement, the edges of whiteness expanded to absorb new populations, those whose assimilation could stabilize the control grid. In this way, whiteness evolved not as a fixed lineage, but as a functional category, a strategy of management. It is no coincidence that the expansion of whiteness has often coincided with the preservation of class dominance. When the social order faced potential collapse, the promise of whiteness operated like a pressure valve, a psychological consolation prize for those whose material conditions remained precarious, but whose perceived place in the hierarchy provided comfort. You may not have wealth or power, the system whispered, but you are not them. Because the foundation of whiteness is illusion, it cannot sustain itself through truth. It must instead sustain itself through emotion, through the cultivation of fear, insecurity, and manufactured pride. For the system to remain stable, individuals must internalize its myths deeply enough to mistake them for selfhood. As such, a very interesting hold is created. The fear of losing privilege becomes indistinguishable from the fear of losing identity. Hence, the lie becomes a lived experience. This emotional architecture turns whiteness into a feedback loop of manipulation. Guilt, pride, resentment, and entitlement all become levers within the larger machine, keeping populations self-policing and compliant. That is why whiteness, as a category, must constantly invent threats to its boundaries. Immigrants, racial others, shifting social norms. Without a perceived enemy, the illusion weakens. In other words, whiteness is not just a set of ideas about race, it is also a psychological economy. It extracts loyalty through emotion, the same way capitalism extracts labor through necessity. The control grid depends on poverty, not accidental poverty, but enforced poverty. It must ensure that certain nations and cultures remain perpetually developing, their resources extracted, but their agency suppressed. This maintains the economic and psychological architecture that whiteness sustains. The illusion that prosperity correlates with proximity to the civilized, the modern, the white. Hence the recurring patterns, coups d'état that destabilize promising nations. Economic exploitation disguised as aid or development, cultural appropriation without compensation, global devaluation of labor, talent, and art from the global south. These are not random historical quirks. They are the operating codes of the grid, a design built to ensure that growth outside its hierarchy is either absorbed, sabotaged, or discredited. Former colonial powers often maintain covert policies that preserve this dynamic, cloaking ongoing domination in peacetime treaties, investment conditions, and narratives of civilizing partnership. Embedded within this grid is another form of violence, the suppression of intrinsic value. Cultures labeled as inferior are denied full recognition of their intellectual and spiritual wealth. Their innovations are extracted, repackaged, and resold through the systems that marginalize them. Their people are told that their histories are lack, rather than lineage. This is how the grid maintains both external control and internalized despair. When a people are convinced that their gift to the world is secondary, they unconsciously feed the very system that exploits them. But the truth is, no empire can exist without what it extracts from those it devalues. The so-called peripheries of the world have always been its creative core. The colonial powers are not the originators of civilization, but its most aggressive archivists, masters of taking what existed elsewhere and branding it with their own signatures. They are curators of stolen light. Yet across the globe, institutions and individuals are working to dismantle these systems. Scholars, activists, artists, educators, and community builders are naming the illusion, exposing its mechanisms, and imagining post-racial futures not based on proximity to whiteness, but on the recovery of human integrity itself. However, confronting the grid is not merely about changing policies or language. It is about disarming one of its main tools, its emotional machine. The system cannot exist without the energy it extracts from fear, resentment, and false belonging. It thrives on division, even among those who wish to dismantle it. This is where what can be called marauderism emerges, a final self-defense reflex of the grid. When structures of power that operate such systems feel threatened, they stir the emotions of the very people they exploit, including those it labels as white, inciting chaos and conflict at the lower levels of the hierarchy while the system reorganizes above. The peasants, as the architects of the grid might privately call them, are weaponized against one another, while the true machinery of control remains untouched. By turning public frustration into misdirected anger, the grid ensures its survival. Emotional manipulation becomes policy. Confusion becomes control. Beyond the illusion, the greatest challenge then is not the recognition of injustice, but the refusal to feed the illusion. The grid does not fear awareness, it fears coherence. It fears what happens when people divest from the myth that their worth must be measured against someone else's inferiority. To say that whiteness is not an identity is not to erase anyone's humanity. It is to reclaim it from the machinery that turned human difference into hierarchy, perception into policy, emotion into control.